The government auction in Tulsa started at 7 in the morning, and by 8 the crowd had already decided who the fool was. His name was Raymond Holt, 53 years old, widower, retired postal worker. He drove a 2004 Dodge pickup with a cracked side mirror and a rosary hanging from the rear view. He was not the kind of man who made bold moves. He clipped grocery coupons. He watched the Weather Channel before bed. He wore the same brand of New Balance sneaker he'd been wearing since 1998 because, as he put it, they still made them and his feet hadn't changed. He had come to the auction with $400 in cash, folded into the front pocket of his Wranglers. The plan, such as it was, had come from his brother-in-law Dennis, who ran a booth at the weekend flea market and sometimes turned seized property auctions into modest profit. Dennis had once cleared $300 on a box of old kitchen appliances. Another time he'd found a working vintage turntable in a lot of busted electronics and sold it to a record collector for twice what he paid. He swore by these auctions. Raymond wasn't looking to get rich. He was looking for something to do on a Tuesday that wasn't sitting in his house watching the ceiling fan turn. The auction was held in a county warehouse on the east side, and the items came from 3 sources: a failed restaurant supply company, a storage unit foreclosure, and the contents of a pawn shop that had been raided and shuttered after its owner was indicted on federal money laundering charges. That last batch was where things got interesting. The pawn shop stuff had a vaguely criminal energy. There were guitars, jewelry cases, old stereo equipment, and in Lot 47, a commercial cash register, a heavy steel model, the kind restaurants used before everything went digital, with a wide drawer and raised keys and a receipt roll that had long since run out of paper. The auctioneer described it as cosmetically rough, mechanically unknown, sold as is. That was the phrase that cleared the room of serious bidders. Sold as is at a government liquidation meant you were buying a question mark. You might get something valuable. You might get a very heavy piece of junk that cost you $40 to haul to the dump. Raymond looked at the register. He wasn't sure why. He didn't run a business. He had no use for a cash register in any practical sense. But something about it pulled at him. Maybe it was the weight of it, the visible solidity of the thing, the way it sat on the table like it was rooted there. Maybe it was that the keys were hand-painted with red lettering, beautiful in a small way, clearly custom work someone had ordered special. Whatever it was, he raised his hand when the bidding opened at $20. It did not take long. A man in a Carhartt jacket dropped out at $40. A woman bidding on behalf of what appeared to be an antique mall dropped out at $55. Raymond said $65 and waited. The auctioneer looked around. The room had moved on. People were checking their phones, talking quietly, already thinking about the next lot. The man in the Carhartt jacket shook his head and said something to the person next to him. Raymond heard the word sucker. He did not respond. He walked up, paid the attendant, and signed the release form. It took 3 men to load the register into the bed of his pickup because it weighed, according to the manifest, 114 pounds. He drove home with it. He put it in the garage. For 2 weeks it sat there. Raymond would pass it on his way to the car, glance at it, and keep walking. He wasn't sure what he planned to do with it. He'd looked it up online and found that old commercial registers, depending on the model and condition, could sell for anywhere from $80 to several hundred. He'd also found that this particular model, a national cash register from the mid-1960s, was considered collectible by a specific and passionate niche of enthusiasts. The hand-painted keys made it more interesting. Custom registers from that era weren't common. But there was a problem. The drawer was jammed. Not slightly stiff. Not stuck in the way old mechanisms get sticky with age. Jammed. As in, it did not move at all. Raymond had tried opening it the first night. He'd pressed the keys. Nothing. He'd looked for a manual release, found a slot but couldn't get it to respond. He'd tried gently working the drawer edge with a flathead screwdriver. Nothing. He told Dennis about it. Dennis said to take it to a locksmith. Raymond thought about it and decided not to, because if the drawer was empty it would feel like wasting money on top of wasting money, and he wasn't ready for that. Then, on a Thursday night in October, he was cleaning out the garage. He bumped the workbench and the register shifted 2 inches on the concrete floor. He heard something inside the drawer, not the sound of mechanical parts, but a soft, papery rustle. He tried the drawer again. Still jammed. He went inside, got a better flashlight, came back out. He looked at the release mechanism more carefully this time, crouched low so he could see the underside. What he found was that a small pin had slipped out of its slot and was sitting at an angle, physically blocking the drawer's internal latch from releasing. It wasn't a lock. It wasn't seized with rust. It was a single misaligned pin, and if he could move it back into position, the drawer would open. He spent 45 minutes on the floor of his garage with a dental pick he'd kept in a junk drawer for years without knowing why. He worked by flashlight. His knees ached. At some point he started talking to himself the way people do when they're alone and focused on something difficult. He said things like "come on" and "there you are" and "once," just once, something that wasn't really a word at all. The pin moved. He stood up, pressed the no sale key, and the drawer opened. Inside was a canvas bank deposit bag, zipper closed, slightly faded but intact. His hands were not entirely steady when he picked it up. It had weight to it. Not the weight of something heavy, the weight of something full. He unzipped it on the workbench. There were bills inside, bundled with rubber bands, the way tellers used to bundle them. Stacks. He counted them once, set them aside, counted them again because the first count seemed like a mistake. It was not a mistake. The drawer of the $65 cash register contained $14,800 in cash. The bills were a mix of 20s and 50s, all of them older, some going back to the 1980s by the look of them, none of them sequential or new. There was nothing else in the bag, no note, no identification, no record of where the money had come from or who had put it there. Raymond sat down on his garage step and stared at the workbench for a long time. He called Dennis that night. Dennis told him to call a lawyer before he did anything else. Raymond called the lawyer his wife had used for her estate, a quiet man named Gerald Pruitt who had an office above a dry cleaner on Main Street. Pruitt told him that money found in property purchased at a legitimate government liquidation auction, when reported to the proper authorities and cleared, typically reverted to the finder. Pruitt also told him the process would take time and that he should document everything, photograph everything, and not spend a dollar of it until the legal picture was clear. Raymond photographed everything. He took the money to the county courthouse and filed the necessary paperwork. He answered questions. The pawnshop case was already adjudicated, the owner convicted, his assets liquidated. The cash register and everything inside it had been legally transferred at auction. The money, by every mechanism that mattered, was Raymond's. The process took 4 months. When the final clearance came through, Raymond deposited the money in his credit union. He did not buy anything extravagant. He paid off the rest of his truck. He put new gutters on his house. He gave $2,000 to the food pantry at his church, not because he was trying to be virtuous but because it seemed right, the way some things just seem right without a lot of reasoning behind them. He kept the cash register. He cleaned it with Murphy oil soap and polished the keys. He put it in the living room, against the wall where his wife's china cabinet used to be. People who came over always asked about it. He told them he found it at an auction. He mentioned it was heavy, that it took 3 men to load it, and that it sat in his garage for weeks before he figured out the drawer. People usually laughed at that part. It was a good story, the fool who wasn't, the junk that wasn't. He didn't usually mention the rest unless they asked. At the flea market, Dennis brought up the register story to anyone who would listen. He had a way of telling it that made Raymond sound like a genius, like he'd seen something in that machine nobody else had. Raymond never corrected him, exactly. But if pressed, he'd say the truth, which was simpler and stranger than any plan. He hadn't seen anything. He'd just felt something. He'd looked at a heavy old register in a government warehouse and felt, in some way he couldn't explain, that it deserved someone to take it home. That was all. That was the whole of it. The auctioneer had moved on to lot 48 before Raymond had even signed the receipt. The man in the Carhartt jacket bought a set of restaurant shelving for $110 and sold it for $95 the following weekend. Raymond drove home with 114 pounds of rusted, stubborn history in the back of his old truck, and 6 long weeks later, on his garage floor at 10 o'clock at night, a single pin moved inside a drawer, and everything, all of it, opened.